What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Stochastic channel, and today we're talking some college football DFS, the Friday slate. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. It helps us out a ton, so thank you if you have done that. All right, I'm going to adjust my camera a little bit. I'm a little low, and right away, I'm going to bring you behind the glass to what we usually use, our player data usage tool, talk about it briefly, and then get into the games. So let me switch off this. This is an FCS game, but we'll begin here with Duke Northwestern. So this is available with our college football package, among other things, projections, ownership, our Sims tool, more on that stuff later. But this specific page, what you're looking at, week by week, this will update. At the top, we're going to have our team by team data, everything highlighted in grays from last year. That'll change to this year, probably next week. A lot of these teams played FCS opponents, so the data is not there in some cases, and in other cases, highly flawed because of level of competition. So I left that alone for last year's stuff. I'll update when it makes sense, just verbally. And then we have your Vegas data. So in this case, Northwestern is a 3-point favorite with a 37 total. These are your implied team totals, very low for both of these teams. As far as the player-by-player stuff, quarterbacks are up here at the top. We have their attempts per game, total yards per game. This will update when there's more games. How many sacks they've taken. Opportunities is sacks plus scrambles plus designed rush attempts, then your yards per carry. You can see Malik Murphy, not very mobile. Conversely, Mike Wright, he's honestly more mobile than I thought, 5.91 yards per carry, but we'll get into that. From here, attempts, that's for running backs, receivers, quarterbacks, whoever carries, the percentage of the attempts they have, their yards and yards per game. And it's the same thing with receivers down here, only we move to targets. And we have target share, targets per game, yards per game, and percentage of routes that a player participates in. This will be a running average throughout the season. I will update verbally when there are discrepancies. So hopefully that makes enough sense, enough of the background. All of the information for our tools, packages, everything can be found below. While we're on this game, I might as well start here. We got into some of the specifics right away with Duke Northwestern. It's a 3-point spread in favor of the Wildcats, 37 total. This number's coming down, so probably even lower by the time it kicks off. At the quarterback position, we have Malik Murphy at 7,300. The fact that he took has zero rushing yards and took 0 sacks, I think is more a product of what this team did in week 1, playing an FCS team. That is neither here nor there. Last year, he found a way to finish with negative rushing yards. So that was with Texas, better offensive line, better receivers, better everything. I think this could be pretty tough sledding for Malik Murphy. And he is no longer playing Elon, which is also a concern. From there, we have the running back room, which, in my opinion, was a little more spread than I thought it would be. Star Thomas outcarried Jaquez Moore, but if you look at stuff like route percentage, Jaquez Moore played a lot more than Star Thomas. I'll highlight that down here. 42% of the routes for Moore versus 27.5% for Thomas. So it's kind of like a 50-50 committee with designed roles, more handling pass down stuff more than Star Thomas, and Star Thomas handling more of the early down roles. So in a game against Northwestern, who is an excellent run defense, not expecting that to be anything worth writing home about. I'm not particularly interested in the Duke running back situation, especially because, like week 1, Duke passed the ball 60% of the time. They were at 24 seconds per play, which is a divergence from what we saw last year. Of course, they have the new coaching staff. But if we're not getting a lot of rushing attempts from these players, and Northwestern has an awesome defense, I think there's better opportunities in other situations. They're just GPB plays, in my opinion. At receiver, Jordan Moore, the locked-in receiver of choice. This makes sense. They lost his running mate from last year. 12 targets immediately, 31% target share, went over 100 yards, 72% route share. You think that rises in more competitive games. Then it's Eli Pancol and Samir Haggins. I don't think we see really much else from this team in terms of rotation onto the field. Javon Harvey, John Tavis Robertson. These are players that should be rotational pieces with Samir Haggins, Eli Pancol, and Jordan Moore locked in to your 3 wide receiver sets. And I think Pancol should be more expensive than Haggins, just straight up at this point, given what we saw last week. And Pankol's been injured at points in his career. I think that's the only thing that's limited him from playing ahead of Higgins. Tight end is a rotation. Nicky Dalmolin, he was at 47% of the routes. Jeremiah Hasley, 47% of the routes. 4 targets apiece. Expect this to continue. And when they run 12 personnel, you'll see, I think, Pankel and Higgins come off the field, more Higgins than anyone else. But the Duke tight ends, I guess, are in play. I don't have a ton of interest, not with Pankel being a little bit more expensive. On the Northwestern side, Mike Wright, 8,100. He had the 65 rushing yards right away in his debut. It's a pretty good mark, and I expect that to be pretty consistent. This team was surprisingly passed the ball 49% of the time. That was very interesting to see, considering their new OC Lujan comes from South Dakota State, where they were often passing the ball in the 30% range, 30 to 40%. We did not have that in their first game, but they were still super slow, 31 seconds per play. And this team, I think, will be more run heavy in the future and rely on their defense, really. But Mike Wright being a piece of this run game, I think, is important because he's very lackluster as a passer. 6.0 yards per attempt. For reference, the college average is 7.4, so he's well below that. And he's had a long career. He's been in multiple programs. I wouldn't expect him to light the world on fire, although Duke's defense is rebuilding quite a bit here. The biggest surprise for me was the 3-back committee that Northwestern decided to use that their coach doubled down on in the press conference. Cam Porter led the way last year, and he still carried the ball 13 times. Was not involved in the pass game. Honestly, like, they barely threw the ball. They just, I don't think, got off enough plays. But Cam Porter, he's firmly in a timeshare. Caleb Komalafe played more than we thought. And right now, I think we're over projecting, this is sportsbooks, over projecting Cam Porter's rushing, under projecting Caleb Komalafe, even though I think they should both be involved. As far as route rates for these running backs, because they were not targeted really at all, I think we do see some rotation between these players, but I would still expect Cam Porter to largely lead the way. Right now, we have Cam Porter at 42% of the routes, Komalafe around 20, Hyman around 7. And that is just diverging a little bit from what we saw last week, but pretty in line. So that's where we have them in terms of the pass game, Porter still being mainly the third down back. Receiver, they didn't throw the ball a lot. Or they did throw the ball a fair amount, but a lot of it was off target and didn't register as targets. But over 60% of the targets went to AJ Henning and Bryce Kurtz. That is nice in the fact that it's projectable. So it's not expensive. These players were on the field every single play. Their wide receiver 3, Frank Covey, he had just a 51.5% route rate. And I don't think we see much else from this team passing the ball. These are clearly the 2 best receivers. There's no reason to throw it to anybody else. At tight end, Thomas Gordon, he split time with Marshall Lang. Neither of them received much work in the pass game, but both of them were out there for a pretty fair amount of the routes. Gordon, he was up above 70%, and we have Lang above 50% coming into this week, which is appropriate for them. Just don't expect a high targets per route rate for the Northwestern tight ends. I would focus solely on Henning and Kurtz if you can. Unfortunately, they're not expensive. They're the top 2 plays in this game. Wright is okay. Porter is okay. Komalafe, I think, is okay as well. Would rely on Jordan Moore as a stud, and then Thomas and Jacques Moore, along with Eli Pankow, more your GPP plays. Second good game on the slate, we turn to BYU taking on SMU. This spread is moving towards 11. It's 10.5 in favor of SMU, 56 total. And it's a game I think we should have a lot of interest right away just from the high implied team total of SMU of 30 points, at 30 points right now. But much better than the previous game. So when you have a 36.5 total, a 37 total sometimes, you're just going to naturally be pushed towards other games, which is the case here. But in this contest, we have, I think, a pretty decent spot to take SMU as a buy low after their FCS game. And before that, playing Nevada really close. Let's start with them. So you have Preston Stone still splitting some time with Kevin Jennings. That's not changing in this game. But I think it's going to be closer to an 80-20 split, similar to what we saw in the first week, even though Jennings has been fine. At some point, I think they just had to name a starting quarterback. The problem is you pay $9,500 for it. There's not that many options on this slate, so I think you probably still look towards Preston Stone as a guy you can lock in pretty clearly. I haven't built lineups yet. I'm not sure where I'll be on cash, but I anticipate playing probably Rourke from Indiana, and then I'm not sure on the second quarterback. It would largely depend on how salaries fall, but not noticing that many expensive skill position players. So Stone might just be the guy you lock in to get the most points. Running back, their second game, playing an FCS team, they took the foot off the gas with Brashard Smith and LJ Johnson. Like their freshman, Derek McFall, had 15 carries. Those all came in the second half when the game was already out of hand. Same thing with Zach Hernandez, all those carries in the second half. Zane Miners actually touched the ball earlier in the game, but still only 2. And they didn't have Jalen Knighton. So his absence definitely contributed to the elevated McFall workload. Right now, we're projecting Brashard Smith clearly the number 1. He's been hyper efficient too on his carries, already at 89.5 yards. He's also a former receiver, so he's excellent catching the ball. 3 targets in their first game, didn't need him in their second game. He should be the lead back. LJ Johnson is dealing with an injury. We're expecting him to play, but he's their bigger back. He should get some goal line touches here and there. We're tentatively projecting him as the number 2 right now, followed by Jalen Knighton, assuming he returns from his injury. All this should set up pretty well for Brashard Smith. You got your next 2 backs dealing with injuries, so make sure you keep your eye on this. McFall, we are projecting back towards his week 1 role, a handful of snaps, even if he even gets that. He's a 4-star freshman, so there's the potential for more, especially if one of Johnson or Knighton misses. But all those carries just came in garbage time, annihilating an FCS team. So I still have questions. Receiving game, RJ Maryland goes from 9 targets to 2. Again, they did not play a real team. That's going to happen. He should be far and away the locked-in target leader. And he hasn't played most of the routes yet this year. He's at 57%. But last year in competitive games, we saw that up at 80. So if this does play to the spread, I would expect a bump in routes and targets from RJ Maryland. He's your safest pass catcher. From there, you have Jake Bailey and Jordan Hudson. I always struggle with the expensive SMU wide receivers because their routes are not vastly different than Romello Brinson, Roderick Daniels, Keyshawn Smith. I honestly would prefer going down and playing those guys, just price adjusted. Of course, if you give me all the salary in the world, sure, I'll play Jordan Hudson. But if salary is a thing, which it is on the slate, there's not much difference other than efficiency between those players, Romello Brinson, Keyshawn Smith, and Roderick Daniels. And honestly, you could make a case for Daniels being the best of these cheap players because he gets carries in the backfield. 3 carries last week, has 0 carries in week 0, but we saw him involved in the run game last year as well. So those carries do give you a floor that the other receivers do not have. 4,600. Aside from Maryland, I would tentatively put my flag on him if you're looking to stack an SMU receiver. Only other guy to really mention is Matthew Hibner. He plays a little bit as your second tight end. BYU, we go to Jake Retzlaff, and BYU is fresh off a dismantling win in their first game of the year over Southern Illinois. Congrats to BYU, but I don't think we saw a lot from this team. They returned their signal caller, Jake Retzlaff, and I'm not sure that's a good thing. He was inefficient last year. Good showing in week 1. He's cheap, so locked into all the snaps. I think you can play some Retzlaff. I'm still hesitant. This is probably, poor judgment on my end. I have the first run of projections done. I'm going to cross-reference this with Retzlaff right now just to see what we have and if I'm being a dummy, which is likely the case. We have Retzlaff at 17.5 points roughly. So, yeah, you should probably be considering him as a cheaper option. We'll see. I'm not all the way there yet. I like SMU's defense, even though they showed cracks previously against other teams. But this should be mostly Retzlaff, not buying Bohannon or anyone behind him. The backfield, I think the superior committee, LJ Martin split with Hinckley Rapati. Miles Davis carried a little bit. And then, of course, this team uses wide receivers a lot in the run game. So that's worth noting. But I think largely what you see is Hinckley Rapati, LG Martin splitting work. Almost 50-50. That was what we saw last week. Martin did have a camp injury, so that could be contributing, but he wasn't the most efficient back anyway. So I would expect a 50-50 committee to remain. Would much rather get to a guy like Brashard Smith. Receiver, only thing to really mention is Darius Lassiter is expected back. I guess I forgot to mention Moochie Dixon's also expected to return for SMU. That muddies the situation further, but that could happen here with BYU. They already rotated receivers a lot last year. The only time they condensed was due to injuries. You have Chase Roberts, Cody Epps, Keelan Marion as your top guys. Darius Lassiter should slide in ideally over Keelan Marion, but I still doubt we see many of these receivers north of 75% of routes. And if they do, it's probably not much. So I would tentatively expect the wide receivers to go Roberts 1, Lassiter 2, Epps 3. Keanu Hill is moving positions. He's playing tight end now, but he still lines up wide a lot. I would put him 4 tentatively, followed by Keelan Marion and Parker Kingston. No interest in anyone listed below those players. So it's a weird game. I think Brashard Smith is your most in play. It's him and RJ Maryland from there, likely looking at a BYU receiver. And I'm still debating Retzlaff, but I think he's going to project pretty well price adjusted, as well as Stone on the other side just from raw points. Last game is Western Illinois, Indiana. This spread is not out, so I used S&P Plus. 42-point spread they project with a 48 total. That gives Western Illinois a 3-point implied team total. Indiana a 45 implied team total. You're never really Xing teams, but that is somewhat debatable on this slate with Western Illinois. As far as the team goes, this team is looking at about a 50% pass rate. They're a slow offense. We even projected for 60 plays exactly. That might be rich. It's just a low-level team. Nathan Lamb is the QB. He looks like he rushes the ball a little bit, but I think you're probably making up for that with sacks, especially against really good teams. Indiana being a much better team than Western Illinois. The backfield was a complete committee. We saw 3 backs involved between Cameron Smith, Torrance Farmer, and Tyler Jordan. Smith handled by far most of the work, and he's not expensive. He actually comes in at the Stone Min. Tempting enough to consider here, but I'm not sure I'll be able to pull the trigger. We saw him with 15 opportunities in their week 1 game. It's just you're going to deal with 0 efficiency. With that said, if you need a cheap guy, Stone Min, he looks to be the one. At wide receiver, Tristan Duncan and Christian Anaya, 84% of the routes and 100% of the routes, 10 and 6 targets. Those are the guys you want to look at. No one else was above 61% of the routes. That was Elijah Aragon, a wide receiver. He split time with Damari Davis, among others, so not too much there. This team does use 4 wide a fair amount. They do not use the tight end on every single play, so that's worth noting. You could get some extra really cheap receivers that maybe pop up for a big play here and there, but I'm not super enticed by it. Last, Curtis Rourke. I think he's the safest quarterback on the slate. Went for 180 yards on just 25 attempts in their week 1 game. They didn't need him to do anything else. They also did not need him to run. He only rushed 3 times. But this is a guy I think you can use in the run game a fair amount if you need to. He does have a season-ending injury on his pass, so that's worth noting. But, I mean, as long as he doesn't get benched early, and even if he does, he probably does enough along the way here. I think he's your safest quarterback option in the slate, given their enormous team total. At running back, Kalen Black got hurt immediately in their last game with a hamstring injury. They took him out precautionary, it was rumored to be, but you never know. Maybe they hold him out just because of the opponent here. When he was out, Tyson Lawton came in, handled most of the work. Justice Ellison was his change of pace. Elijah Green only carried the ball when they were wasting away the game, so I would not play Elijah Green unless you think they're going to do that again, which is possible, I suppose. And if Kalen Black returns, I don't think Elijah Green is very involved. The receiving room, we did see a little bit of weirdness. Donovan McCulley was banged up. They didn't have EJ Williams still, so there's still some questions with the Indiana pass catchers and some moving parts. I wouldn't be surprised if they held out McCulley or EJ Williams just because of the opponent. With that, they had Omar Cooper, Miles Price, and Elijah Surratt as the 3 receivers. Looking at a very strong bounce-back game for Surratt. Only 3 targets, but he led the team in routes. Cooper and Price, I think, are just fine. And Horton is a tight end that played on 65% of the routes, just about 63%. Not much rotation there. He would be the other guy I look at. If McCulley returns, I think he probably plays a larger role, but that remains to be seen. And that about does it for the slate. Again, I think the receivers are pretty clear. Looking at Jordan Moore for Duke, RJ Maryland for SMU, probably one of the studs for BYU or getting to a Northwestern guy. I think Kurtz and Henning are fine. At running back, it's a fairly weak position, but Cameron Smith, if you need a min-price guy, makes some sense. Otherwise, I'll be playing a lot of Brashard Smith again. And then at quarterback, Rourke is, I think, the safest. Preston Stone, Retzlaff, and Mike Rice to be guys we consider in this spot as well. That'll do it for the slate. Thank you guys for watching. Much appreciated. Hit the thumbs up button on the way out, and we will see you guys tomorrow for the main slate. Until then, good luck and have a good one.